They shot him with silver. Not bullets. Not betrayal. Silver. Because the only way to kill a king is to know he's a monster. Rafael DeLuca, the most feared mafia boss in the city, built his empire on loyalty. Men swore oaths in his name. Families trembled at his shadow. No one dared cross him. Until someone from his own blood circle sold him out. Left bleeding under a dying moon. Hunted by enemies, abandoned by his own pack. The last person to find him wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a bodyguard. It was a street Curvy whore the city refused to see. And that night, betrayal created a monster. But compassion decided what kind. In this city, power isn't inherited. It's taken. And Rafael DeLuca didn't just take power, he dominated it. By day, he was a calculating mafia boss who ruled the underworld with iron precision. By night, he was something older, darker, the alpha of the strongest hidden wolf pack in the region. He protected his own. He punished betrayal. He believed loyalty was sacred. He was wrong. Because the most dangerous enemies aren't across the battlefield. They're standing right beside you. This is a story of betrayal, of rage, of unexpected compassion, and of a revenge so calculated it reshaped an entire city. This is the story of the Judas Alpha. Rafael DeLuca walked through the dim lights of the Velvet Lounge like a god among men. Every head bowed as he passed. To the city, he was the mafia boss who controlled every shipment and every street corner. To his pack, he was the alpha whose scent alone could make a grown man drop to his knees in submission. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His power was a heavy weight in the air, cold and steady. The Rossi family has agreed to our terms, a voice muttered from the shadows. Rafael nodded once. He didn't celebrate victories, he expected them. He sat at the head of a long oak table, his large hands resting flat on the wood. He was a man of discipline. Every move he made was like a game of chess, planned 10 steps ahead. He looked at the men gathered around him. They were his brothers, his wolves, his life. He felt the bond of the pack humming in his blood, strong and unbreakable. Or so he thought. Beside him sat Matteo, his second in command. Matteo had been with him since they were boys. As Rafael spoke about the new borders and the safety of their territory, he felt a strange flicker of heat coming from his friend. It wasn't the usual warmth of loyalty. It was sharp, like a hidden blade. "You're being too soft on them, Rafael," Matteo said, his voice a bit too tight. "We should have taken everything they owned." Rafael turned his gaze toward him. His eyes, dark and piercing, held Matteo's for a long moment. "We take what is fair to keep the peace. Greed creates enemies we don't need." Matteo looked away first, but not before Rafael saw a spark of something dark in his eyes. It was envy, deep and bitter. It was the look of a man tired of standing in a giant's shadow. Rafael felt a small chill at the back of his neck, a warning from his wolf, but he pushed it down. He was the king. He was untouchable. He trusted his blood, never imagining that the hand currently holding his drink would soon be the one holding the silver. The night was black and heavy as the 3-car convoy sped down the lonely coastal road. Rafael sat in the back of the lead SUV, his mind already moving to the next day's business. Beside him, the air felt thick and strange. He glanced at Matteo, who was staring out the window, his jaw tight and his hands gripped firmly on his knees. Rafael felt a sudden prickle of unease on his skin, a warning from his wolf that something was wrong. Suddenly, the driver slammed on the brakes. Tires shrieked against the asphalt as a massive black truck pulled across the road, blocking their path. Before Rafael could bark an order, 2 more SUVs swerved behind them, trapping them in a cage of steel and blinding headlights. "Ambush!" someone yelled, but the word was drowned out by a hail of gunfire. Glass shattered into 1,000 diamonds. Rafael dove for the floor, reaching for his weapon, but a sharp, burning pain exploded in his shoulder. He gasped, his breath hitching. This wasn't the dull sting of lead. It was a searing, poisonous heat that raced through his veins like liquid fire. Silver. His heart hammered against his ribs. Only those closest to him knew that silver was the only thing that could truly tear through his alpha strength. It weakened his wolf, pinning his spirit to the earth. Outside, his loyal guards were falling one by one, their cries cut short by the relentless rhythm of the bullets. Rafael kicked the door open, tumbling onto the cold pavement. Blood soaked his shirt, silver-tainted and dark. He looked up through the smoke and the chaos, searching for his second-in-command, expecting to see Matteo fighting by his side. Instead, he saw Matteo standing perfectly still near the front truck. He wasn't reaching for a gun. He wasn't running for cover. He stood with his arms crossed, his face cold and empty of the brotherhood they had shared for decades. The shock hit Rafael harder than the silver bullets. The man he called brother was simply watching him die. In that moment, the Alpha realized the Predator wasn't the enemy in the SUVs. It was the shadow that had been standing beside him all along. The world began to fade into a blur of red and silver as the king of the city finally understood the price of his trust. The cold rain began to fall, mixing with the dark blood pooling on the pavement. Rafael dragged his broken body away from the wreckage of the convoy. Every inch of his skin felt like it was being eaten by acid. The silver bullets were still lodged deep inside him, acting like a poison that paralyzed his inner wolf. Usually, his wounds would knit together in seconds, but now, his healing had slowed to a crawl. His wolf howled in his mind, trapped behind a wall of burning metal. He collapsed into a narrow, trash-filled alleyway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The smell of wet brick and old grease filled his nose, a sharp contrast to the expensive cologne and leather he usually wore. He was the Alpha, the man who ruled with an iron fist, yet here he was, shivering in the dirt. As he lay there, the truth became clearer than the pain. This wasn't just a random hit by a rival family. This was a calculated execution. Matteo hadn't just wanted him dead, he wanted his throne. By using silver, Matteo had ensured that Rafael wouldn't just be injured. He would be erased. The realization sparked a flicker of white-hot rage in Rafael's chest. It was a small flame, but it was the only thing keeping him from drifting into the darkness. He had given Matteo everything. He had shared his power, his secrets, and his protection. In return, his brother had sold him for a crown of blood. The anger tasted like copper in his mouth, stronger even than the silver's sting. He tried to claw at the brick wall, but his fingers lacked the strength to grip the stone. "Not like this," he wheezed, his voice a ghost of its former command. The world began to tilt and fade. The glowing streetlights turned into blurry smears of yellow. Just as his eyes started to flutter shut, a sound echoed through the mouth of the alley. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic march of a soldier or the polished click of a hitman's shoe. These were light, uneven footsteps. Someone walking through the shadows of a city that had already forgotten him. As the darkness pulled at his mind, Rafael saw a figure stop at the edge of his vision. He didn't know if it was a savior or his final executioner. Luna stood at the edge of the alley, her thin coat pulled tight against the biting wind. The city usually ignored someone like her, a woman the world called a street curvy whore, someone meant to be used and forgotten. She had learned to keep her head down to survive the harsh streets, but the smell of copper and burnt ozone stopped her in her tracks. She looked down and gasped. Laying in the trash was a man who looked like a fallen mountain. Even covered in blood and grime, she knew that face. Everyone did. It was Rafael DeLuca, the Mafia boss who ruled the city with a whisper and a roar. He was the man who owned the very pavement she stood on. Yet here he was, broken and dying in the dark. Luna hesitated. Her mind screamed at her to run. If his enemies found her with him, she would be dead before she could blink. If she turned him into the police, she might get a reward, but she knew the crooked cops would just finish Matteo's job. She looked at his pale face and saw the raw pain etched there. For the first time in a long time, she didn't see a monster or a king. She saw a soul that had been tossed away, just like her. "I must be crazy," she whispered, her voice trembling. She reached down and grabbed his massive shoulders. He was heavy, a solid wall of muscle that nearly pulled her over, but Luna was stronger than she looked. Life on the streets had given her a different kind of toughness. She strained, her boots slipping on the wet ground, as she began to drag him toward the small, hidden basement room she called home. Once inside the dim light of her room, she began to wash his wounds. As she wiped away the blood, her breath hitched. The jagged holes in his chest were twitching. Right before her eyes, the skin was trying to knit itself back together, bubbling and snapping in a way that wasn't human. Fear cold as ice raced down her spine. She realized then that the rumors were true. Rafael DeLuca was something more than a man. She looked at the door, wanting to bolt, but then she looked back at his closed eyes. He looked vulnerable, despite the silver burning in his veins. She reached for a clean cloth and a bowl of water. He was a monster, perhaps, but tonight, he was a monster who needed a friend. She chose to stay. The air in the small basement room suddenly turned freezing cold. Raphael's body jerked on the thin mattress, his muscles roping and tightening like steel cables. A low, guttural growl vibrated in his chest, a sound that wasn't human. The silver in his blood was fighting his inner wolf, and the struggle was tearing him apart from the inside out. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open. They weren't the dark brown eyes of the Mafia Boss anymore. They were glowing like molten gold in the shadows. He gasped as the sound of snapping bone filled the quiet room. His fingers clawed at the bedsheets, his nails lengthening into sharp, lethal points. The monster was clawing its way to the surface, fueled by a blind, white-hot rage that wanted to destroy everything in sight. "Stop," a soft voice commanded. Raphael lunged upward, his large hand snapping around Luna's throat. He was a second away from ending her life, his vision blurred by the red mist of the change. But Luna didn't scream. She didn't struggle or reach for a weapon. Instead, she placed her small, warm hand over his massive, trembling wrist. "I've seen monsters before, Raphael," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I've seen them in expensive suits and in dark alleys. They don't have fur or glowing eyes, but they are far scarier than you." The Alpha froze. He looked into her eyes, searching for the terror he had seen in every person he had ever met. He expected to see a victim waiting for the blow. Instead, he saw a reflection of his own pain. He saw a woman who had been hunted by the world and had refused to break. The growl in his throat died down to a whimper. The golden glow in his eyes faded back to brown as he forced the wolf down, his body sagging with exhaustion. He let go of her neck, his hand shaking. For the first time in his life, someone had looked at the beast inside him and hadn't blinked. He was a king who had lost his kingdom and a wolf who had lost his pack. But in this tiny, hidden room, he found something he never knew he needed. Someone who wasn't afraid of the dark. While Raphael lay in a cold basement, a different kind of darkness was taking over the city. In the grand boardroom of the DeLuca estate, Matteo sat at the head of the long oak table. He leaned back in the heavy leather chair that had belonged to Raphael just 24 hours ago. He ran his hand over the polished wood, a slow, greedy smile spreading across his face. This was the seat of the Mafia Boss, and now it was his. The room was filled with the remaining members of the pack and the family's top soldiers. The air was thick with tension and the scent of grief. Matteo looked at the faces around him, his expression shifting into a mask of fake sadness. "Our Alpha is gone," Matteo said, his voice ringing out with a forced heaviness. "The Rossi family took him from us. They blocked the road and opened fire. I fought to get to him, but the silver, it was too much. Raphael died a warrior's death." A low murmur broke out among the men. Some bowed their heads in shock, while others exchanged suspicious glances. Marcus, a veteran soldier who had served Raphael for years, narrowed his eyes. Raphael was the strongest of us all. How could a few Rossi thugs get close enough to use silver? Matteo leaned forward, his eyes turning cold and sharp. The mask of the grieving friend slipped for a second, revealing the hungry predator beneath. "Are you questioning my word, Marcus? I was there. I watched him fall while you were safe in your bed." The room went silent. Matteo stood up, his presence filling the space with a new, cruel energy. He didn't care about the sacred bonds of the pack or the old rules of loyalty. To him, Raphael had been weak, too focused on peace and fairness. Matteo wanted more. He wanted the city to tremble not just at his shadow, but at his bite. "From this moment on, I am the Alpha," Matteo declared, his voice dripping with arrogance. "The old ways are dead. We are going to take everything this city has to offer, and anyone who remembers Rafael DeLuca's mercy can follow him to the grave." As the men reluctantly lowered their eyes in submission, Matteo felt a rush of power. He had traded his soul for a crown of blood, and he didn't regret a single second of it. He believed the king was dead, never realizing that a monster was currently healing in the dark, fueled by a rage that would soon burn his new empire to the ground. 3 days passed in the silence of the basement. On the morning of the fourth day, Rafael DeLuca finally stood up. The silver was gone, drawn out by Luna's careful hands, and his skin was smooth once more. But he wasn't the same man who had fallen in the alley. His eyes were no longer glowing with the wild heat of a wounded animal. Instead, they were as cold and sharp as shards of ice. He moved across the small room with a predatory grace, his strength returning in waves. He grabbed a heavy metal chair and crushed the armrest with a single squeeze of his hand. His mind was a map of the city, and every street led to Matteo's throat. The fury inside him was no longer a fire out of control. It was a weapon he had learned to aim. "You're going back for them, aren't you?" Luna asked. She was sitting at her small wooden table, watching him with those calm, steady eyes that had seen through his monster. "I am going to burn his world to the ground," Rafael said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I am going to tear the crown from his head and show the city what happens to a Judas." Luna stood up and walked toward him. She didn't flinch as he towered over her. "And then what, Rafael? If you just burn everything down, what makes you any different from the man who betrayed you? You'll just be another monster standing on a pile of bones." Rafael paused, his hand still tight on the ruined chair. Her words stung worse than the silver bullets ever could. He had always seen himself as a protector, a man who ruled with iron, but also with a sense of sacred duty. If he let his rage turn him into a butcher, he would lose the very thing that made him an alpha. He didn't just want Matteo dead. He wanted the city to remember why they had followed him in the first place. He didn't want a simple bloodbath. He wanted a correction. He looked at Luna, the woman who had saved his life without asking for a single thing in return. Her compassion had carved a hole in his anger, leaving room for something else. He wouldn't just be a mafia boss seeking revenge. He would be a king returning to fix what was broken. The city began to breathe a different kind of air. It wasn't the loud, messy war Matteo expected, but a cold wind that chilled him to the bone. Rafael moved through the shadows like a ghost. He didn't strike at Matteo directly. He began to pull the threads of his empire apart, one by one. It started at the docks. A warehouse filled with Matteo's most expensive cargo went up in a silent, brilliant flash of blue flame. There were no witnesses, only the charred remains of a kingdom that was already starting to rot. The next day, the money followed. Secret bank accounts that Matteo had spent years filling suddenly went empty. It was as if the gold had simply turned to dust. In the dark corners of the city's bars, the mood shifted. Loyal captains who had bowed to Matteo out of fear began to receive messages. They weren't threats. They were reminders of the old ways, of the mafia boss who had actually cared for their families. One by one, men who were supposed to be guarding Matteo's back began to disappear or simply stop answering their phones. A single phrase started to drift through the underworld like a fever. "The Alpha is alive." The words reached the DeLuca estate, echoing through the halls like a death sentence. Matteo sat in the grand office, his face pale and sweating. He had doubled the guards and locked the gates, but he felt more trapped than protected. He jumped at every shadow and screamed at his men for every small mistake. He realized that Rafael wasn't just coming to kill him. He was erasing him. Matteo looked out the window at the city he thought he had won. He saw the flickering lights and felt the weight of 1,000 eyes watching him from the darkness. He had stolen a throne, but he was finding out that a crown is very heavy when you have no one left to help you carry it. The fear was a poison worse than silver, and it was spreading through his veins. He knew the king wasn't just coming back. He was already here, and he was taking back everything that was his. The full moon hung in the sky like a giant, glowing eye, watching as the front gates of the DeLuca mansion swung open without a sound. Inside the grand hall, Matteo stood alone, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The shadows seemed to stretch and grow until a massive figure stepped into the light. Rafael was back. He didn't look like a dying man anymore. He looked like a force of nature. "You should have stayed in the dirt," Matteo spat, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and hatred. "I was tired of being your shadow, Rafael. I did the work, but you got the glory. I deserved that seat more than you ever did." Rafael didn't waste words. With a roar that shook the glass chandeliers, he shifted. His clothes tore as his body expanded, his fur as black as the midnight sky. Matteo shifted too, his wolf smaller and gray, driven by a desperate, ugly hunger. They crashed together in a blur of fur and teeth. The sound of their struggle echoed through the empty house, a brutal dance of power and betrayal. Rafael was faster and stronger. He pinned Matteo to the marble floor, his massive claws pressed against his former friend's throat. The monster inside Rafael screamed for blood. He wanted to feel the life leave Matteo's body. He wanted to end the man who had left him for dead. But then, a memory flickered in his mind. The smell of a small basement room and the calm, steady voice of a woman who wasn't afraid. What makes you different from them? Rafael leaned in close, his golden eyes burning into Matteo's terrified face. Instead of closing his jaws, he shifted back into his human form. He stood up and looked down at the man who had betrayed him. "Killing you is too easy," Rafael said, his voice cold and steady. "From this moment, you have no name. You have no family. You have no pack. You are nothing." Rafael didn't strike the final blow. Instead, he stripped Matteo of his title and his identity in front of the silent soldiers who had emerged from the hallways. He cast him out into the night, alone and broken, with nothing but the clothes on his back. For a wolf who lived for power, being a ghost in the city was a fate far worse than death. Justice had been served, not with a blade, but with the cold truth of a king who had finally found his soul. The halls of the DeLuca estate were quiet again, but the air felt different. It was no longer thick with fear or the smell of secrets. Rafael sat in his chair, but he didn't look like a man who was hiding behind a wall of soldiers. He had reclaimed his throne, but he hadn't come back as the same cold mafia boss. The fire of betrayal had burned away his old self, leaving behind a leader who understood that true power wasn't about making people tremble. It was about making them believe. His first act was to change the laws of the pack. He put an end to the unnecessary violence that had defined his earlier years. He taught his men that loyalty was earned through protection, not through threats. The soldiers noticed the change. They saw a king who listened more and shouted less. They saw a man who had faced the darkness and decided to bring back some light. But the biggest change came on a night when the whole city was watching. Rafael held a gathering at the heart of his territory. In the center of the room, standing beside him, was Luna. She didn't wear diamonds or silk. She wore the same quiet strength that had saved him in that basement. The room went silent as Rafael took her hand. He didn't introduce her as someone he owned or someone to be hidden away. He looked at his people and spoke with a voice that carried the weight of a mountain. "This is the woman who saw the man when the world only saw a monster," he declared. "She saved the Alpha when his own blood had left him to die. She is the reason this city still has a king." The city began to whisper. They talked about the new era of the DeLuca family. They whispered about the Judas Alpha, the man who had been marked for death but had returned as something stronger. He hadn't just survived the silver bullets and the betrayal of his best friend, he had evolved. Rafael DeLuca still remembered the pain of the alley, and the anger was still there, tucked away like a sharp blade. But now, it was guided by the compassion he had learned from a stranger. The revenge was finished, the traitors were gone, and for the first time in his life, the king was finally at peace.